Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sensor Plane Photography Podcast. I'm Jason Odell, and this is where light and technology come together. Each episode of this podcast, I like to talk about creative techniques, and no different today. One of the creative techniques that I want to focus on a little bit today is the use of high dynamic range, or HDR, techniques in your photography. Now, there's a wide range of places you can go with HDR, and I want to touch on some of those things today. There's a couple different ways we can talk about it. And when we talk about HDR technology or techniques, we're really talking about two things. One is expanding the dynamic range of our images by capturing multiple images, bracketed exposures, several stops apart, and merging them together into a 32-bit environment in which we do a process called tone mapping. Now, a lot of people, when they hear HDR, they think about the tone mapping part because that's what gives a creative look and feel to the image. So what I want to discuss today are some ways to work with your images to get that HDR look without necessarily having to do true HDR, and also some other things to expand dynamic range without having to use tone mapping software. Because what I find with my photography is that sometimes the tone mapped images, the true HDR images, can still look a little bit extreme, a little bit more stylized than images processed using more natural ways. And then there's other times where I just want to apply that HDR style to images where maybe I haven't created a sequence of images. And there's lots of reasons for that. I mean, sometimes things are just moving too much across the frames and you get ghosting, and it's just not feasible to merge your images. So I want to look at some different techniques that we can do to expand dynamic range and also to create that sort of painterly or more HDR stylized look in our images and how to work with those. So let's take a look. Let's jump into the computer and see how that works. Okay, I've got some images pulled up here, and what I want to do is talk about HDR techniques. Now, if you're using a camera that's been made, a digital camera made in the last 2 or 3 years, chances are there's actually quite a bit of good quality highlight and shadow detail already in your image. And the first HDR technique or dynamic range technique that I want to show you is just simple shadow and highlight recovery. So if I go to this range of images here, and let's just open one of these images up. If we look at the histogram, even though this image looks like it's got some blown out tones in the whites and some dark clipped shadows, if you look at the histogram, you can actually see that that's not the case. What we have is a lot of shadows, a lot of highlights, and if we look at the middle of the histogram, not a lot of midtones. So if you're using a raw editor, like in this case Lightroom or Aperture or anything, a camera raw, there's tricks that we can do to recover a lot of the shadow and highlight detail. So if I just were to pull down the exposure slider a little bit to get the highlights where I like them, you notice that that comes at the expense of the shadows. These tones in here get very dark. But I can use the shadow slider to pull those back up. And doing so creates almost an HDR kind of image. I don't mean HDR in the true sense. I mean, we're not merging images here, but we're creating an image that has where I'm bringing out the tone and the dynamic range. Now, if you don't want to use just a shadow slider, because this is a globalized adjustment, one thing I could do is just use one of Lightroom's onboard tools, like the graduated filter tool. Create a graduated filter on here, and choose exposure. And you'll notice I dropped the exposure down here by about 0.9, 0.86. And if I just apply 0.86 on the exposure here, I just offset that. And if I really want to, I can just bring up the exposure on this area right here. And if I need to refine that with other tools, I could, like using the brush. So the first thing about HDR images is to consider the idea that if you've exposed your images reasonably well for the highlights, in other words, you're not clipping any highlights, then you might be able to just recover a lot of shadow details and then process your image normally from a single image. When you process from a single image, you have some advantages. You're not going to have any artifacts from motion, from things moving across the frame. You're not going to get those strange tone mapping, compression artifacts where everything looks smushed together. And you get a real natural image. The downside of working with a single image in this way, however, is to it comes at the expense of a little bit of noise, grain in the shadow area. So if you're really making strong shadow or exposure adjustments to recover those lost details, you're going to get an image that might not be as clean as you would otherwise. But this is an excellent technique. Now, let's talk about HDR techniques where you need to use more than one image. So let me reset this guy and go back to my grid view. And let's take this sequence of images here. Okay, I've got ones that are exposed for the highlights and ones that are exposed for the shadows. And I really don't need to bring out this image too much, but let's just go to this one and this one. Now, if you have Photoshop, which you can get now via subscription from the Adobe Creative Cloud, what I can do is I can send these images to Photoshop as a stack of layers. And again, this will allow me to blend them together. To do this, all I need to do is choose Edit In, and I'm going to choose Open as Layers in Photoshop, and it's going to fire up Photoshop for me. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and I've got both of my two images from Lightroom now stacked on top of each other in layers. And in order to view these, all I need to do is create a layer mask and allow some of the underlying layer to show through. So I'm going to create a layer mask on this layer and then use my brush. I'll set the opacity to something like 30% so I can build this up. And I'm going to use the black foreground color to erase. And when I do that, you can see that I'm painting in and allowing the underneath layer to show through. And with a little bit of work, I can make sure that I'm not overdoing the highlight areas. And I'm just blending the two images together. Now, this works again when you don't have a lot of motion across the frame. But again, it gives you a very realistic kind of look because we're not doing anything funny with compressing tones. We're just using multiple frames to deliver one for the shadows and one for the highlights. Now, when we talk about tone mapping, now we're trying to get a particular HDR style. And we can do that in the traditional sense with more than one image, but we can also use HDR software or other plugins to mimic that HDR look and get that sort of creative, stylized, surrealistic looking kind of image. So let me show you the first way that I might operate, which would be to merge three images together in an HDR program. So I'm going to use HDR fxpro 2. This is from the Nick collection by Google. I'm going to export these out. And then by using the plugin, I can create a very stylized look. I can compress the tones, I can change the style or the method in which the tone mapping is applied. And really what this is doing is adjusting micro contrast. So I can open up shadows, I can do all of this stuff. And when I'm happy with this, if I want to get this particular look, I can just click Save, and it makes a copy of those images merged together. I can also do this in Photoshop. Now, what I find a lot of times here is that I'll still need to do some cleanup. You can see I've exaggerated a dust spot. I might want to use some plugins to do some other effects. So what about just working with a single image and creating this tone mapped effect where we're not using a true HDR, we're just going to use a single image? Well, we can do that too. Let's go back to one of these images. I'll start with this one. And let me open it up in a different program. Let me open it up in Color Effects. And I'm going to use a filter called Detail Extractor to really crank this up. And let me add in another filter here, contrast only. So I'm going to use contrast only, and I'm going to use the soft contrast slider. That opens up the shadows. And then I'm going to use Detail Extractor, really create this grungy kind of look. And you can do this with single images. I could also run the same image through HDR fxpro as just a single image. And when I do that, then what happens is I can get those tone mapping effects, but they're going to look far more extreme. Now, one of the things I like to do when I'm working with an HDR tone mapped image is to not finish right away in the HDR program. So we zoom in on this, we can look and see that there's this stylized effect. Let's go ahead and clean this up. Let me zap a dust spot here. And then I'm going to open this in Color Effects. And by doing this, I'm going to be able to take the image a little bit further than I could have just as HDR. I can either smooth out rough areas, or I can even make it more stylized. So for example here, in my Detail Extractor filter, if I want to get a particular look. And then another filter I really like to use on my HDR is Glamour Glow. Let's throw that on there. And that's going to have this effect to kind of soften up some of those rough edges and give this an interesting look. Now, if you're using the Nik plugins, one cool thing is that you can control where they're applied by using control points. So if I didn't want too much of this Detail Extractor up here in the sky, I can put a minus control point up there, and it gets smoothed out a little bit. Okay, so as I've shown you here, there's a lot of different ways of getting stylized looks on your images that you don't have to use HDR tone mapping software or collect a series of images. Now, obviously, if you can do multiple images for true HDR, you're going to have a lot more latitude in controlling the shadows, the highlights, recovering those tones. But you can still apply those effects using HDR software on a single image, or using certain plugins like Detail Extractor and Color Effects Pro. Topaz filters have some that provide similar effects. And then if you don't want to create a true HDR image, if you're looking for a more natural look, consider doing things like just inside your image editor using the exposure slider and the shadow recovery tools. And if you do it subtly, it's not going to look overcompressed, it's not going to look fake. You're going to get a nice range of tones, whether you did it on a single image or on blending two images together. And that's really where we are right now with the power of today's editing tools, is that we can really do a lot more just in our raw files than we could do 5 years ago or so. So keep those things in mind. You can apply these creative effects, and don't forget, when you use one plugin, you can still apply other plugins on top of that, or just finish it off in your editor like I showed you with the dust spot removal. You don't have to worry about those things all at once up front. You can work on your images sequentially or iteratively, if you will. So that's what we've got for today. Be sure to check out all of the episodes of the Sensor Plane podcast over at the blog at www.luminescentphoto.com/blog. And I'll be back soon with another exciting, I hope, episode. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.